Hello, everyone who's tuned in wherever you are in the world this evening, especially with me competing against England on the TV. I'll take it as an honour that you've decided to come listen to this for the next hour. Propaganda, it's not usually a subject that would sell spaces on an online lecture or on a tour. But for me, it's something that's been a developing interest over the last few years in particular. And I have to say that's down to two individuals. Firstly, the late and greatly missed pal of mine, David Cohen, who many of you will remember from his wonderful art that he used to be able to collect and publish and then sell or what have you. And he managed to, I was always interested in propaganda posters, but could never afford them. The originals are absolutely astronomical prices. But he did pass on to me the image that you can see there on your screen, which is a hand-painted postcard that was sort of signed off for publication. Now, I've never seen another copy of this or one that whether it actually made it to print or not, but it was certainly signed off, and it was called The Track of the Hun. And as you can see there, it shows a rampaging horde of Germans heading over the horizon and leaving in their wake across the battlefields of France a trail of empty, or presumed empty, bottles of Moet and Chandon. And I just found that a fascinating piece of imagery. And the artist of it was a fairly prolific publisher of propaganda posters, but this is a hand-drawn image. So yeah, fantastic thing for me to acquire there off David. And the second person really is I signed up for the master's degree course at Wolverhampton a number of years ago. About Britain in the Great War, and of all the lectures that were on offer throughout the course, perhaps the one I was least looking forward to was the one about propaganda. Yet conversely, that turned out to be one of my called Professor Stephen Badsey, who was the lecturer on that occasion, and I was absolutely spellbound, mesmerised by the stuff he had to say. So I chose it as one of my lectures to write upon. I did fairly well, got quite a good mark on that. What you're going to be relieved to hear is, so I'm not tonight going to give you an academic paper read out to you. Instead, this is going to be more of a sort of all-encompassing stroll through propaganda from 1914 to 1918 from a British perspective, how they emerge from having nothing to having something, and trying to bring in as many of the key points along the way. So you should find it, hopefully you find it, an engaging and somewhat illuminating tour of that story of propaganda. So without any further review then, let's start right at the beginning in 1914. And it's really fair to suggest that Britain really has no formal propaganda machine at all at that time. Yet by the time we get to the end of the war in 1918, what we have got is a very complex, all-encompassing, state-driven control, not only over the national media, but one that's running alongside a fairly comprehensive psychological warfare operation, a lot of this emanating from GHQ. Now, in those days, before Snapchat, before Twitter, before even the internet existed and endless Zoom calls on the evening for you to tune into, remember there was not even a television or wireless in those days, really, public wireless. The real mass organs of mass communication were the daily newspapers. It's hard for us today to understand exactly how important these newspapers were. You know, today if a leading ex-editor of the National Press storms off of a GMTV studio, whatever statement they're trying to make is quickly reduced to a simple meme that is used humorously across the internet to describe anyone's displeasure. Back in 1914, when an editor had the power to almost bring down governments as well as put them in place in the first place, we have to understand how important they actually were. In fact, for many newspaper editors, they believed that their primary role was to inform opinions among their readership as much as it was to report events. That's quite a statement, isn't it? Two of the most important ones, people around here, two of the biggest paper barons of the time were Lord Beaverbrook and Lord Northcliff. And Beaverbrook says of Northcliff that his power was so considerable that it was of the utmost importance in all matters of public interest to secure his assistance, or in any way, at any rate, his neutrality. So what that's telling us there is right from the get-go, it would be very important to get Lord Northcliffe on side if you had any, you wanted a message to get across. There was a number of ways that we could do this. If we're looking at the front line, the newspapers really were there to dictate exactly how that war was being reported. And they would do that twofold, really. Firstly, to reassure the participants. So should the soldiers be lucky enough to pick up a newspaper, and it wasn't as impossible as you would assume. You remember in places like Arras and Ypres, Daily Mirror, the Daily Mail had printing presses and regularly churning out newspapers for the troops there. But also, if they fell into the enemy hands, that they would somehow demoralize the enemy. Away from the front line, if we're looking back, projecting that message back home, or even overseas still, it was to maintain the morale of the civilian population, but also to secure support of the neutral. And the first sort of venture into the newspapers and propaganda, if you like, was when the Daily Telegraph published a book or pamphlet known as How the War Began. This appeared in, I think, early September of 1914. A number of you tuning tonight will probably have it among your collection of Great War books. One of those things that you never pick up, you never read, but it's old, so you don't put it in the car boot and you keep it. But this was literally published in the millions and sent across the country to anyone that sent off for a copy. And its opening paragraph says a lot about the tone of the book, and I'll just read it to you now. It suggests that, moreover, the average man of intelligence who reads his daily newspaper with care is apt to be so distracted with the series of telegrams constantly put before him that he cannot see the wood for the trees. A great number of people are asking themselves why Europe is at the present convulsed with war, and especially why we are dragged into the quarrel. This was not so much about how the war began, but really a justification of why we are in it. And certainly the war didn't begin because of anything we did, Gov. But nevertheless, a fascinating early article. Now, what was interesting about this war is, firstly, at home, mass support for it. That's a generalization. I mean, I'm sure there are people that dissented against the war, but not in the numbers that we've seen in more recent conflicts that we're going to be aware of over the last sort of 20, 30 years, for instance. We tended not to question the reasons for the war, and it was an easy sell for the authorities to the population in the UK. Equally as important that was, remember, we were at the heart of the British Empire. It stretched a long way there. We can talk about how much of the globe was pink. And certainly when we look at Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand, South Africa, the West Indies, and all of the outposts of the empire, again, largely this support was unopposed for what Britain's foreign policy was from across its loyal empire, and nearer to home, places like Ireland. You know, initially there were people who were generally in support for the war effort, so it was not a hard subject to sell. Whereas today, modern conflicts tend to be a lot more convincing of the public than we had at the time. Charles Masterson comes up fairly early on in all of this. He was the Liberal MP, and he, on the 2nd of September, this was chaired a meeting that was regarded as, or is often referred to as, being a mobilization of intellect. And he invited to this meeting a number of people from various stratas of society that were quite important, a number of social influencers. These aren't the people with massive Instagram followings like we see today, but these are classical sort of writers like Arnold Bennett, H.G. Wells, Rudyard Kipling, Arthur Conan Doyle, and Thomas Hardy. All of those in the room so we could garner their support for the war effort. publishers also needed to be included because they were important, how much influence they could get and how many articles they could get out amongst the public. So there were representatives from Macmillan's, Hodder and Stoughton, Methven, and also the Oxford University Press. The academic institutions, you know, you need to get these guys on board. This is where we are training a lot of our younger generations and having that ability to culture their intellectual beliefs. So both Oxford and Cambridge had representatives there. And if you look at the Oxford Modern History faculty, they actually suggest fairly early on that Germany has committed inexcusable crimes and the war was one of civilization against barbarism. That's quite some statement, isn't it, from one of our leading universities? Not to forget the popular press, who also needed to be included. So we had people from the Pall Mall Gazette, the London Illustrated News. These were widely read by the average man on the street. So again, if we can get them on board, it's very important that we do so. One of those was in the room that's of particular interest to me is this character, George Bernard Shaw, partly because I speak to you from the lovely part of the world called Nebworth in Hertfordshire, and just a mile or so away is where George Bernard Shaw spent most of his latter life, a little place called at St Lawrence. So I sort of grown up on dog walks, seeing Shaw's Corner and places like this. So I was interested in where he fell into all this. Shaw himself was very much a political activist, but also quite an established playwright by the time he attends Masterson's meeting. His most prominent work being the writing of Pygmalion. He had a very, very complex character, it's fair to say. He promoted eugenics, which is, almost a way of purifying the human race that dates back to Homer's day, an ancient sort of belief that you're able to breed out certain things in amongst the human race. And also he felt very strongly about alphabet reform as well. I mean, that's quite something to feel strong about, isn't it? But that was the simplification of the alphabet to make it a lot easier. And again, both of these causes are still sort of hanging around corners of the internet even today. Aside from that, he denounced vaccination. So he'd be a very interesting person to speak to currently, wouldn't he, to see how he feels. So a big denouncer of vaccination. And also he opposed most organised religions. So it's fair to say that George Bernard Shaw often had opinions, and he wasn't shy in telling you what those opinions were. In fact, when he attended this meeting, he came away and he wrote an article called Common Sense About the War. And I suspect it was entirely what Charles Marston had not been looking for when that report goes on to say, I see the Junkers and the militarists of England and Germany jumping at the chance they have longed for in vain for many years of smashing one another and establishing their own oligarchy as the dominant military power of the world. Now, this, safe to say, did not go down well with the people that had called the meeting or the authorities. That's exactly not what they were looking for. And it did lead for a period of time where George Bernard Shaw was somewhat ostracized in public life. One of his ex-friends, Sir John Grier Irvine, actually says his appearance at any public function caused the instant departure of many of those people present. But he does turn around that view somewhat. If we pick it up by 1917, when Douglas Haig is the commander-in-chief, by then he's invited across to France by Haig, and as a result, he writes a 10,000-word report on the soldier's life, the everyday living conditions of the soldier, and he was certainly someone who welcomed US entry into the war. So we can see even George Bernard Shaw's views mellow and change as the war goes on, and this is a common thread we see when we look at the emergence of propaganda from a British perspective. Charles Marston then goes on to form what we knew as the Secret War Propaganda Agency. This is often referred to as just being known as Wellington House, London location. Obviously very secret indeed. Masterson herself, was the Liberal MP, and a very troubled man in later life, it's fair to say. But their job when he set it up was to operate clandestinely and mainly to promote sympathy for Britain overseas. So we're definitely seeing an emergence of what we would regard today as straight out propaganda there. By October of 1915, they'd produced no less than 6 million posters and 14 million pamphlets or books to be sent worldwide. And when you look at that as a standalone figure, you think, wow, that is some incredible effort to get that out. I mean, if only Pen and Sword were able to publish 6 million of your books a month, then you'd be a lot better off, wouldn't you? But yeah, incredible figures there. But if we contextualize that against the way the world was in those days, I found this fascinating, that the quality of leaflets and posters I've just mentioned there are comparable to those produced by political parties in peacetime election campaigns, and the poster budget, 6 million posters, was exceeded by the expenditure of the Rowntree Company in advertising just one brand of chocolate in 1 year before the war. That an amazing statistic, the power of advertising and posters at that time in history. They went on to promote a series of arts lectures and art exhibitions across the US, which were obviously going to be our primary neutral that we needed to sway. And they sent a lot of artists, European and British, or I say that people in the London art scene primarily, not all British. A lot of them were people that had fled from Europe into London, but they would send them across to the US to go on these very successful art exhibitions and lecturing tours. And it's been suggested that that was one of the largest, certainly the most comprehensive arts patronage schemes in US history. And also today, even my own dealings by visiting the beautiful Gallipoli Peninsula as often as I can, Charles Marston is certainly someone who sparks debate even in modern Turkey, because he was very scathing of what occurred in Armenia and used that certainly as a way to drum up support for war against the Ottoman Empire. So is someone best to avoid discussing when you're out there entertaining the mayors of various Turkish cities and towns. One of the first things they actually did was to get together a collection of these famous artists and writers and photographers and see how they could start to publish these propaganda volumes. And an early version of that was the report of the Committee on Alleged German Outrages. Now, I'm not going to sit here tonight and suggest that, the Germans rampaged across Europe, murdering millions and millions of babies. We know there were a number of atrocities. We know about the Tyroliers and the fear of Tyroliers amongst the Germans during that war of the Battle of the Frontiers, where there were numerous occasions where they shot first, asked questions later. In fact, when I've been on tour before with Jack Sheldon, one of the things I'm very privileged to own, it was passed on to me by an old veteran when he passed away, was a small German phrase book, German French praise book that he'd picked up from a prisoner that he'd captured at the Battle of Arras. And I often show this to Jack to translate the phrases. And a number of them are, I remember the British equivalent when I went to Germany, which was things like how much is a pint of beer, which way to the railway station. And in this book of 1914, some of these German phrases translated into French are things like round them all up or I will burn your village down. Take me to the mayor, I have someone to shoot, and stuff like this. It's incredible stuff to read. Anyway, I digress. A key figure in all this is Louis Remakers, who was a Dutch artist, cartoonist, who was very, very much on the side of Holland or the Netherlands entering into the Allied side in the early phases of the war, having witnessed what occurred going through Belgium in those early months. This led to him falling out of favor with the Dutch authorities because they didn't want to be pulled into the war quite so much. So he fled to London, and by 1915 was putting out this sort of cartoons you see there at the bottom, Über alles. With the Kaiser depicted as the devil sat on a huge pile of skulls. And he was one of the men that went to America, actually, Lura Makers, and was very, very successful in publishing his art and cartoons out there. One of the early publications that came out was this Nelson's History of the War. And again, this is probably taking up too much of your bookshelves already. Most of us have these copies of red, hard volume bound history books that have been lent to us by a relative or passed on by a good, well-meaning neighbour, or picked up in a car boot sale, that we think are going to be valuable one day. And invariably, they were published in so many thousands, they're not much worth much at all. But Nelson's History in the War certainly had its propaganda links. And amongst the artists that were involved, Muirhead Bone, Paul Nash, William Orpen, and Eric Kennington. I mean, what a lineup that is for artists if you were doing a war artist first 11. Muirhead Bone is the man you can see there on the top left of your screen, treading through that Flanders mud. John Buchan, of course, on the right, John, who lost his own son in the Great War. Alex serving with the Royal Scots Fusiliers during the Battle of Arras, of course, and went on to write a number of really important war histories, including the South Africans in France, which is a great account of the war. Muirhead Bone was certainly impacted by his role in propaganda, and that certainly affected him, so that he was led to write or record, "I am no longer an artist. I am an artist who will bring back word from the men who are fighting to those who want war to go on forever. Feeble, inarticulate will be my message, but it will have a bitter truth, and it may burn their lousy souls." So certainly someone who fell out of love with his role there. Of course, in the early stages of war, this was the man in charge. This was our boss, Sir John French. Sir John French certainly comes from that sort of Victorian background with regards to journalists. And in fact, as recently as the Crimean War, which is certainly in living memory, the press was described as the potential enemy within its gates, capable of undermining civilian support by exposing the true nature of modern war. To that end, Sir John French's mantra was to avoid newspaper interviews at all costs. Not the best of news for those back in Fleet Street, but he would, however, entertain off-record discussions with certain trusted journalists, people that he felt would be speaking the truth. This wasn't quite enough for the barons in Fleet Street, who certainly were seeking a bit more meat on the bones. The early British Secretary Force attempt to quench this thirst for knowledge back home in London was to get our old friend Ernest Swinton to write a series of eyewitness reports. Now, many of you would have heard that name, Ernest Swinton, before, because of his involvement in the development of tanks, of course, and also because he wrote the ones that you should have on your shelf that are very useful, that series of books called 20 Years After, which is a sort of then and nows of the battlefields in the late or in the mid-30s, I think it is, but a fantastic couple of books they are. It's fair to say that Swinton's reports did not go down well with the newspaper barons in London. They would refer to this as journalism light, and they still at this stage were very keen to press for having their own embedded war correspondents. Eventually, John French does allow a couple of people to get involved, and it's these two characters here, some wonderful cartoons of the pair of them there, Taffy Gwynn of the Morning Post and Charles Reppington of the Times. Taffy Gwynn had been the editor of the Morning Post, but had also been quite a key advisor during the Curragh incident. This, of course, occurred just prior to the Great War, and actually checked quite a few careers of high-profile officers because of their involvement in it. It's certainly worthy of a talk on its own, the Curragh incident. And suffice to say, we haven't got enough time to go into details this evening. He was well connected to a number of the key players, including Henry Wilson, Willie Robertson, Hubert Gough, Julian Byng, Ivor Maxey, and Douglas Haig, all of whom knew Gwynn well enough to speak to him. So he was able to get quite a lot of information off those guys as they were in various stages of their career. On the other corner, we have Charles Reppington, who worked for the Times. He's the guy holding up the copy of the Observer on the right. He did have a military background himself. He'd served with the Rifle Brigade, and he'd actually attended Staff College. It was on the same course as Plumer and Horace Smith Dorrien. So again, he had a number of people in his camp that would trust him and speak to him. They included Willie Robertson and Archibald Murray, of course, two very important characters and chiefs of staff. They're responsible for both the Mons Dispatch and the Shell scandal. The Shell scandal did not go down well back home with the UK government, or actually with the commanders in the front line at the time. But nevertheless, you could argue it was a worthy document to report, or incident to report. Haig was not so keen on Charles Repington, so when he comes to the fore, it's fair to say that Repington's influence does diminish somewhat. And with that, we should turn our attention to the man himself, Sir Douglas Haig. It's very fair to say that he goes from cynic to active participant when it's with regards to the Great War, propaganda in the Great War. He had no interest in the subject at all to start with, and by the end of it, he's very, very much involved. In fact, he would refer to this as the psychological offensive against the enemy, something that we put so much effort and energy into these days in modern warfare, psyops, of course. 1915, when he comes to power, there are a number of stories breaking that would make that propaganda all the easier, really, when you look at the fact that we've now got the first origins of unrestricted submarine warfare, not quite unrestricted this time, but we're starting to see it. Of course, the bombing of Scarborough from the sea, the bombing of London from the air, and also that use of gas for the first time and flamethrowers. All of these are definite sticks to beat the Germans with. As a result, when he takes over in the BEF, he does appoint 5 embedded journalists into the BEF, and he also abolishes the censorship of the national newspapers as early as December 1915. I mean, prior to that, any really nitty-gritty accounts you want from the front line, most amateur historians will know you go to the local press as opposed to the national press, because there was a lot less censorship of publishing letters back from the front, that sort of thing. By 1916, Haig was actually entertaining Lord Northcliff on various visits he'd came across to France. And if we look at how Haig recalls that meeting between two of them, he says of Northcliff, "I was favourably impressed with his desire to do his best to help win the war. He was most anxious not to make a mistake in anything he advocated in his newspapers, and for this he was desirous of seeing what was taking place. I am therefore letting him see everything and talk to anyone he pleases." Now, this is quite an incredible turnaround, really, because just prior to or just on the news that Haig takes over in command, the Sunday Times had actually written, "There are spots on every sun, and it must be confessed that the new commander-in-chief does not like journalists." So that's a real turnaround in their relationship in a fairly short space of time. And I just first of a number of quotes that I picked up from Stephen Badsey, who wrote a fantastic book on propaganda or the British Army, its public image, well worth a read. He says, consequently, and I don't argue with, I agree with this 100%, the manner in which Haig fought what is now often called the media war is a neglected factor in assessing Haig's achievements. And that's certainly something I'm going to be banging that drum when I speak to the Haig Fellowship lunch this year on parts of Haig's life. As we move into 1915, then, we really need to pick up the story of swaying the neutral. The Secret War Propaganda Agency at this stage would describe their workers not as purveyors of lies or distortion, but as professional persuaders trying to attract supporters through the force of their convictions and arguments. What a fantastic line that is, isn't it? Really, really good line. It covers all bases. I really like that. One of the things that emerges at this time, you see the poster on the left there for the rather snappily entitled CCMPO, the Central Committee for National Patriotic Organisations. This is not something from North Korea. This is something that occurred in the UK and was set up as an independent educational body. And there you can see one of their meetings being held in the Guild Hall on May the 19th, 1915. When I say I put a question mark behind it being an independent educational body, that's because we should remind ourselves that Asquith was the president, the Foreign Secretary Balfour was the vice president, and that the committee took their advice from the War Office and worked in cooperation with the government. That's the genuine description of independent right there, isn't it? A number of trade union conferences across the UK were leafleted with various information. They certainly wanted to keep as much peace as they could, as Britain still needed to output and increase their output into the war effort. So what they could ill afford was labour disputes, more of that a bit later. And then we used other elements that we had to our power, the neutral press committee being one of them. By using our international communication network of Morse code, we were able to transmit a lot of our stuff and updates across to foreign press agencies to spread that message outside of the shores of the UK. The Foreign Office News Department was issuing daily news telegrams to any of the news agencies that wanted to receive them. And fascinating, this one for me, Reuters, who were struggling somewhat and were neutral in all of this, they actually signed £120,000 an annum per annum fee to broadcast official statements of the war. Now, they made use of them, no doubt, and gave them the heads up on a number of the other agencies. However, that £120,000 price they paid for that effectively also paid for our own propaganda machine to keep working per year. So a very good piece of business that was. By the end of 1915, we are outputting over 1 million words a month overseas. So our voice is starting to get heard outside of these shores, and that's very, very important. Of course, the place we needed it hearing most of all was in the US. And, I've been told that caught in Uncle Sam because they're certainly the country we needed to influence most of all. And for that, we have a very, very interesting policy of how we do this. The person we employ is Sir Gilbert Parker. He was a British MP from Kent, but was a very, very successful Canadian novelist. His books were read pretty much across the globe, but certainly in North America and in Canada, he was very much a household name. And it was his idea to avoid swamping the US with propaganda. That was being done by various other people, including a sort of German attempt to do so. But from our perspective, that's not what we were going to do. Instead, what Parker said about doing was to secretly target influential individuals, and he used his Who's Who book that included lawyers, doctors, businessmen, politicians, scientists, academics and teachers, really getting into the intellectual planes of American society. And he actually put together a mailing list of 260,000 people across America that would receive not general pamphlets and general leaflets, but personal letters from him, scholarly material directly from Parker, albeit having been written by a big team he had working for him, as opposed to being just pumped out by the British authorities. It made them feel valued. It made them feel worthwhile. He would always try and avoid emotional, overt propaganda. He felt the best way forward was actually to encourage some form of measured debate about how the war was progressing, why the war had occurred, and he would try and appeal to both the intellect and the ego of the recipient of who he was writing to. So very, very clever use of people's personality traits there. Of course, one of the chaps that gets involved is Cecil Spring Rice, who was at that time the British ambassador to Washington. And he sums it up as saying that he led them to believe they were making up their own minds. Very clever. And just because I know we're Western Front Association and we like to spring back to France every now and again, we should mention Cecil Spring Rice's connection with the Somme in particular, in that his younger brother was killed on returning from a trench raid with the Border Regiment, the Lonsdale Battalion of the Borders. I think it's the 11th Borders, up and around the Avalui there, is hit by a stray bullet at Crucifix Corner, and is buried in is it Avalui or Ortui Cemetery? Sorry, just down by the banks of the river. Beautiful spot. And in part, in tribute to his lost brother, Cecil Spring Rice put the words, "I vow to thee thy country," to Hulse Planet Suite, in memory of his brother who'd been killed on the Somme. Of course, the other thing that's going to be key to courting the Americans was the sinking of the Lusitania, and more importantly, the Zimmerman telegram, which we will refer to in a short while. By now, we're at the midpoint of the war and also the midpoint of this talk, you'll be pleased to know. And there was a complete restructuring of the way our propaganda units operate. Firstly, and importantly, the Home Office, Foreign Office, and War Office units kind of merge into one. So instead of working independently of each other, they're coming under one roof. And this eventually becomes known as MI7 and was headed up by Lieutenant Colonel Warburton Davis, intelligence officer at the time. They were housed at Ad Astral House, where they had 24 staff working permanently among 4 different departments of MI7. Importantly as well, this was one of the few areas of our war effort that was supported by both Lloyd George and Haig. As we know, they didn't always see eye to eye, but this they were very much on board with. So if you can garner the support of Whitehall and Westminster, as well as GHQ and France, then you're not doing a bad effort. One of the first things, and I think Charles Marston was involved in this to a degree, was that incredible film that we've all seen, the Battle of the Somme. We should never underestimate exactly how important that film is. 20 million viewers per week. Now, when you think 20 million adult viewers per week out of a 43 million adult population, that's quite incredible, isn't it? See how many people witnessed that film. We know that the actual captions were tailored to encourage people to feel engaged with that film. So when it came up, the Lancashires at the front, you know, that would be especially well received in the kinemas of Burnley and Bolton and what have you, that sort of thing. Again, Stephen Badsey is the go-to man for anything to do with the Battle of the Somme, and he wrote sums it up perfectly in one little paragraph here. The Battle of the Somme remains what it has been since its first appearance, the absolute essential starting place for any discussion of how the British people at home understood the Western Front during the war, and how the British Army in the First World War has been understood around the world ever since. Incredible film, well worth another look, even if you only saw it last week. Now let's move on to that Zimmerman telegram, because there, somewhere in the bowels of this magnificent building there, you can see the Admiralty building that sits on Horse Guards Parade there. And it was a little room known as Room 40, the top secret naval intelligence room. So secret that it's only recently we started to learn anything about it. And it was really from there that we probably get an idea of what the Zimmerman telegram is. Now, I don't expect you all to know it word for word, so I'll read it out to you. But effectively, to put this in context, what we have here is a telegram signed by Zimmerman, which has gone directly to the Mexican government with the view of offering support if they were to make a military incursion into America. And this is in the shadow of the Pancho Villas War and still very much a hot potato in America at the time. And so this is exactly how the telegram read. We intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor in spite of this to keep the United States of America neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis: make war together, make peace together, general financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territories in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The settlement in detail is left to you. You will inform the president of the above most secretly as soon as the outbreak of the war with the United States of America is certain, and add the suggestion that he should, on his own initiative, invite Japan to immediate adherence and at the same time mediate between Japan and ourselves. Please call the president's attention to the fact that the ruthless employment of our submarines now offers the prospect of compelling England in a few months to make peace. Signed, Zimmerman. Now, the real controversy of that is not over whether the telegram was actually written and sent. Of course, we know it was now. It was really, the controversy was how we broke it out into the press. So there's quite an elaborate sort of almost James Bond-esque way of pretending that we'd stolen it off of desks in embassies in South America, so that we weren't able to give away that fact that Room 40 or Naval Intelligence was able to intercept these German coded telegrams. For me, I feel that the Zimmerman was far more of a reason why America enters into the war, as was the sinking of the Lusitania, and this, along with that drive to court Americans by the propaganda units, including people like Gilbert Parker, is eventually what leads to them joining in on our side. As we reach the sort of last couple of years of the war, we see a further restructuring of our propaganda system. Firstly, in February 1917, Marston is sort of pushed to one side somewhat. He's reduced in his influence. Instead, the man that was at his original meeting back in September 1914, John Buchan, is made the director of the Department of Information. This is, again, an independent but centralized propaganda unit answering directly to the Prime Minister. In April of 1917, we launched the National War Aims Committee, and this was really for, on the home front, the way that we would fulfill the need to educate the working man as to exactly what the military situation and needs would entail. And of course, 1917, it's fair to say, when we get to, other than the, we look at Messines as an initial success, the first couple of days at Arras, but it's a fairly bad news on the home front with what's occurring across the globe. But specifically, the fighting in Passchendaele does take its toll on morale of both the fighting man and also the people back home. The church bells certainly rang out briefly at the Battle of Cambrai, but as we know, at this stage of the war, the British Army had perfected their way of breaking into the German positions without yet breaking through, and that's not to come for another year. So there is a need for the propaganda to keep rolling out to maintain that morale at home and also from troops in the front line. March 1918, actually, that Department of Information actually then becomes the Ministry of Information, and that man, Lord Northcliff, has finally got his position of power within the propaganda unit officially. He was initially offered a place on Lloyd George's sort of front bench or in his cabinet, but he declined that, and instead, along with Lord Beaverbrook, took up this role at the Ministry of Information, and by now that's employing over 500 staff. Think how big that has grown in such a short space of time. Lord Esher comments then that the press taking over the powers that Parliament have abdicated, a natural outcome of what is called popular government. There we are, the press having more power than the Parliament. Here we have Lord Northcliff, of course, a very imposing character and quite a controversial one as well, really. Certainly him and Lloyd George fall out after the war. It's suggested after he got that job as the Ministry of Information that the Germans actually planned a raid on his own house and dropped bombs in his garden to try and kill him in situ. That such was his influence. And certainly he was one for putting out, as you can see there on the right, these sort of leaflets that would be dropped over the battlefields, sort of advising Germans that they had no future to keep the war up. There were a number of initiatives that came about and that they took a significant involvement with at the time. One of those, of course, being the Zeebrugge raid of 1918. Now, this is something that I'm particularly fascinated with, and so I actually do give a presentation on the Zeebrugge raid, partly because it involves the old Gallipoli gang in a long way. A lot of the guys that had come out of Gallipoli, planning-wise, get involved in the Zeebrugge raid, and it was certainly something that was on the British mindset from sort of 1916 onwards, but by the time Roger Keyes actually gets to launch the raid in April of 1918, of course St George's Day, his effective way that he's controlled the Channel Fleet means that to all intents and purposes the raid isn't required, because the amount of ships that are being sunk by the time we launched the raids had reduced so much that actually, we can never really quantify or justify the effort that goes into it by reducing it that little bit further. It's a real boy's own scene. You can see there that famous sort of painting and the film. If you've never watched it, another great bit of propaganda. Just put into YouTube Hearts of Oak and watch the film that was made about the Zeebrugge raid. I mean, all elements of this smack of the propaganda unit in full flow. You can see there that in the press, this idea that even I think that's a 1st of May, that thing on the right, but it sort of shows you there the Navy taking the salute from Admiral Drake in somehow saying that making the connection between the Royal Naval's efforts at Zeebrugge, along with how Drake scuttled the Armada. And you can see my men singed the king's beard and yours have singed the Kaiser's moustache. Well, how much they singed the Kaiser's moustache, we're not sure about, because a quite incredible statistic I always take away from the Zeebrugge raid is that as far as we can see, there were only 9 Germans actually killed in that raid, German personnel. Quite incredible statistics compared to our own losses, our own effort, and what we achieve. And I think there's almost 9 Victoria Crosses awarded for the action as well. Undoubtable for bravery, and it was a real boy's own effort. So not taking anything away from the effort into the raid, but what it actually materially achieves is actually more about the propaganda story than what we do on the ground. And that's proven by that image you can see at the bottom there, the Lewis gun from HMS Vindictive already going off on tour, as were various parts of the Zeebrugge raid around the country. And if you set that into context, April 1918, things aren't going so well for us on the Western Front. So if we've got any good news stories to take away from that, the better. And Zeebrugge was certainly where they hang their hat. Another fascinating part of the lecture that I remember most of all was the story of the body factory. In fact, it part inspired me to write my dissertation on the breaking of the Hindenburg Line by the 46th North Midland Division in this sector. I mean, that was really because it's the only part of the war where we can compare the British, American and Australian troops over the same ground on the same day against roughly the same enemy with very different results. But one of the byproducts of that was this supposed story of uncovering a body factory deep in the bowels of the Hindenburg Line tunnel there over just by Bellicourt. Of course, the stories of body factories had long gone back in war propaganda. I think it's in late 1914 that we mistranslate a story in a local German newspaper talking about the use of melting down animals to make glue. And we kind of misinterpret that, and we sort of say, yeah, there's a body factory using casualties as opposed to dead animals. And you can see that image there of the Kaiser pointing to the sort of glue factory with the young private gulping, am I next sort of thing. The Germans actually, I believe they made a serious attempt to get us to retract that story. They were never very happy with it. And in true style, I think if you look at page 77 on one edition of the Times, probably squeezed between the Lonely Hearts column, there might be a 1-line retraction. But regardless, the story hung around like a bad smell. So when some troops, Australian and British and American troops, get over the top of that tunnel entrance there, and they come across what they believe to be the remains of a body factory, a number of them get it off on a postcard and send it back to their dear mum. You should see what we've just found. And what they've actually uncovered, of course, is this incredible series of boiling pots full of arms and legs and things, horrific stuff. But by the time a member of the Royal Army Medical Corps I think it's a colonel, arrives on the scene, has a look round. He's able to ascertain with the same sort of ability of Poirot the scene of the crime, and discovers that actually this is a German field kitchen where a shell has come down through a sort of ventilation shaft and blown the poor chef and his commie chefs straight into their own soup. But that's not before that story has taken a sort of a wider appeal and has spread outwards, and people start believing it. And when I was at Canberra researching my master's dissertation, actually, I did come across a number of letters from soldiers writing back from this Battle of the Hindenburg Line who were claiming to have witnessed it as a body factory. Quite fascinating stuff. But again, I think Stephen Badsey wrote a book on that, so well worth having a look more about the body factory. One thing that I've always collected memorabilia to do with battlefield tourism. I obviously own a battlefield tour company, so it's always been something that's interesting to me. And one of the things I have got in the collection is this very unique battlefield tour that took place in the March of 1918. And that image on the left is taken from the sort of brochure, the program that everyone that participated in the tour was given. And you can see it's almost Soviet-esque in its imagery there of the hard worker with his hammer there, shaking hands with the Tommy as he's making his way out the front line. And that's the symbolism we wanted to get across. It's March 1918. There were a number of labour disputes back home. Things were getting a bit concerning about people uprising against the government. And so therefore, we felt the best way to do it is to send a number of the agitators across to France to see if we can sway their opinion. The actual reason behind the tour is summed up in the letter that I've got that is attached to the brochure. And it says, the purpose of this tour is to maintain commitment and morale on the home front. A number of union men and industrialists were chosen to visit France on an official tour of representatives of British Labour in large numbers to the Western Front. Now, the timing of it was quite incredible. They went across in 4 or 5 different groups, the latter groups arriving on the 18th of March, and their tour having to be cut short because, of course, on the 21st of March, 1918, it gets very much a realistic battlefield tour because the Kaiserschlacht, and they're sent home early. My actual copy that I've got that I'm indebted to, in fact, my copy doesn't belong to him, but I was indebted to an account that was passed on to me by Andrew Robertshaw, who's got a copy of this brochure as well. And in his one, he's got the diary of this guy called John Carrigan, who was very much not a unionist, but a union leader. It's a typo there. He's a union leader. And he recalls in his diary that he's written alongside this brochure, well, I feel it has been the greatest honour that has come my way to be one of those selected to go. And I feel it is my duty to do all I can to try and keep things going. For if our men are going to do what they say, that is to do their utmost to bring things to a close before the winter, we have all got to do our bit. If you read stuff by Carrigan prior to this battlefield tour, he was very close to arranging major labour disputes and almost wanted an end to the war in its entirety. But actually going out there, seeing the soldiers, what they were getting up to and exactly what they required, swung his opinion round, which I think is a great bit of propaganda by getting these people, or influencing these people by getting them out on the ground, and probably does enough to see us over the line with regards to a number of these union leaders. So I'm going to finish up really with the legacy of that Ministry of Information post armistice. It's fair to say that we lived in a very much a war-weary country that were almost beaten down with the images of what was happening on the Western Front, the stories of the soldiers coming home, obviously the mass casualties, the mud, the what have you. And despite the quite brilliant performance of the British, American and French armies in 1918, certainly from late July onwards, a lot of the press attention actually focused in and around the Eastern victories. Now, whether that was sort of bit of pre-end of war posturing to put us in the right position, because certainly one of our key drivers there will be to focus on the east, as we're trying to change we're still a naval power, of course, and we're trying to upscale our fleet from being coal-fired to oil-driven fleet. So we needed to remain our influence in the Middle East. So could we nurture support before the war had even ended? But images in the press were far more likely to be like this one of General Allenby entering Jerusalem there. Very proud of the efforts of the 60th London Division in the capture of Jerusalem, and I've got my uncle buried out there as well with them. And I've been to visit that spot. Quite an amazing battlefield if you get a chance to go. But that would be focusing in on the press. And in some ways, what that does is it leads to a long-term underappreciation of the success of what our BEF achieved in public memory. That's probably up until quite recently. That's probably up until, people like John Terrain start to influence us or reawaken us to what the BF actually achieves on the Western Front. And then no doubt in part to all of us as collective members of the Western Front Association who have gone out there and said, how many arguments or discussions have we been in before when people have said, oh, First World War, what a waste of time. And we've said, well, can I stop you there? Because, there is an alternate view, which I always feel is my long-term duty to the men that fought it, to try and talk about their achievements as much as their sacrifices. So the Ministry of Information was very much in one there pushing on Eastern victories. And I think that impacts on how the BF is remembered on the West. And then that image there on the bottom, absolutely fascinating. Most of the staff from that Ministry of Information office, literally on a Friday, went home, came back to the same desks on the Monday morning, and they simply flipped over the sign that went from Ministry of Information to the National War Museum, that of course we know better today, once it transfers from Crystal Palace to Lambeth, as being the Imperial War Museum itself. Now that alone I found absolutely fascinating when learning about this subject on my MA course. My understanding would have been, like many, I guess, that the Imperial War Museum was something that we decided 10 years after the war to say, perhaps we should have a museum for that there war. Let's get a few bits and bobs. The idea that it was almost a seamless transition from the propaganda unit into the Imperial War Museum conjures up so many sort of thoughts and questions and what have you. And I think that's a fascinating way to sort of end the presentation. The last thing I'll just mention is that the legacy of that propaganda does outlast the war. The photograph or the poster you see there in the top right of the British Empire Union is actually a post-war poster that is actually encouraging you not to employ Germans. Every German employed means a British worker idle. Every German article sold means a British article unsold. The war on the Western Front and the rest of the world may have ended on the 11th of November, but the war on propaganda in the hearts and minds of the British people is going to go on for some time after that. And so I think I'll end there, David, and take any questions there are.
Super. Thanks ever so much indeed, Clive, for that excellent presentation. That was really interesting. Thanks ever so much. Ladies and gentlemen, if we can just, in the Time London manner, thank Clive with a virtual round of applause by the raising of the hands. Clive, you probably can't see anything there, but on my screen I can confirm that there's literally hundreds of hands being raised as a virtual round of applause. So please take that as an initial thank you from everybody who's participated. Okay, folks, it's Q&A time now. So Terry, right, fire away with your question. I can't actually see you, but not to worry.
Yeah, I am here. Nice to see you again, Clive. How's the Addocks?
Hi, mate. Yeah, not so bad, mate. New ownership. Yeah. It's all good.
How did we deal with the German Americans and Irish Americans in the USA to, influence Americans to come along with us?
Well, that's really interesting, actually, because one of the controversies over Louis Remaker's, when he went off on tour to America, we were quite astounded and somewhat shocked when he signed a contract with one of the American news outlets that we knew was very pro-German. and we were like, well, why are you, why are you doing this? These aren't the people we're meant to be talking to. These are people we're meant to be going against. But he said, no, I'll influence them from within, which is something he actually achieved. And they started to, I don't know whether it was unknowingly, it can't be unknowingly, but they started almost publishing. So you had pro-German newspapers publishing anti-German propaganda on the back of Rumeyker's involvement with him and signing a contract. So I think the way we played the America game was very, very clever, very, very clever indeed. Whilst there were obviously sort of parts of America that were largely German settled, that tended to not get quite so involved in the war effort as we'd like to think, it wasn't enough, Terry, to make that difference in the end. I think they did a cracking job at influencing them.
Thanks very much.
No problems. I'll see you next month. I've got to talk for your branch.
Yeah. Thanks, Terry. Adrian, fire away with your question, please.
So I'll ask the second of the two if I may, David. Yeah, thank you very much, Clive. Just, Clive, what would you say is the sort of main legacy of propaganda? In other words, what lessons were learned, from the era that you studied, compared with what you see today with modern warfare, please, especially with so much technology around? So we've moved on through, bits and pieces of paper. What would you say are the sort of main lessons learned, if you like?
Yeah, well, I think that you are able to use, that initial fear when we look at John French and referring back to the Crimean War, saying that any involvement by the press is, we just want to avoid it. We want a media blackout. There needs to be certain media blackouts for security reasons at times. However, there's no doubt that we learned from the Great War that you can influence the public with the right use of the media. And the title of the talk tonight really is saying that propaganda, is not a dirty word. Obviously it's a reference to Blackadder. There's some truth in that. It's become a dirty word nowadays, but I don't see necessarily it can be. It doesn't have to be. If you are able to put across a very honest and intellectual debate that is weighted in the way that it's going to turn people around to your point of view, then that's something that we should be using, and I think we still do. And certainly the psychological warfare or psyops is such a huge part of modern campaigning that I think that people like Douglas Haig were well ahead of their game by considering it an important part of the war. And it's certainly not an area that we've probably studied enough. When we there's so many of us studying the Great War, isn't there, at every single pocket. This is one area where we probably need to look a bit deeper into it and understand that.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks very much for that.
Right. No, my pleasure.
Thanks, David, as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Steve Scott.
Yes, I was just interested. The term propaganda, was it used before 1914? What are the origins of the word?
Blimey, if I wasn't on screen now, I'd be typing in the word Google. That's fascinating. I wish someone tell me. It sounds ancient Greek. I'm going to say propaganda. I'm going to say that its origins are a lot older than that, and I'm going to put my claim in to say that it's got ancient Greek origins, but I'm sure the learned viewers online still, there's 262 of them, so someone's going to know and pop up and win the prize.
We'll invite people to have a quick look at Google while we're doing this and pop the suggestions in.
I'm just wondering, was that a term that would have been used in the 14-18 war? Or is it something that is in 1860s that we've moved back and applied?
Oh no, okay, Steve. No, it was definitely in use during the Great War. I mean, the unit was actually called the Secret War Propaganda Unit, but the actual origins of the word, I believe, go back as far as ancient Greece. But
well, thank you.
Nice, good to see you. Thanks for the question.
Thanks for that. We're getting someone suggesting it's Latin, so we'll. Oh, here we go. Right, propaganda comes from the Latin propagare, meaning to spread or propagate. So
well, yeah, there we are. And we know the Romans were. I mean, I'm passionate about the Romans as well, David, and they quite often steal things off the Greeks. So I'll hang on to the Greek thing.
I'll pretend I knew that, but in fact, thanks to the various people who were making these answers on Q&A. Okay, folks, you can stop. We've got loads piling in now. So
good. There we are.
Right, we'll call a halt
I think
on
we
that.
should carry on, David. There's nothing better than listening to Yorkshire Latin. I think it's a great combination.
It's not
Could be
going to
onto
happen.
something.
It's not going to happen. I've got a question from Becca Bernstein here, who I think doesn't have a webcam. So Becca's asked, in the lead up to World War II, were the same propaganda tactics used, or was it a different strategy? So
that's a great question, and I think that there is a slight difference, and the slight difference is that we are able to in 1914 it was very much that we were going to be the triumphal deliverers of justice. I think in 1939-40 we're able to almost become part of the victims of what was Prussian militarism in the First World War and becomes National Socialism in the Second World War. So that there was so much reconciliation, certainly between the armed forces communities between the wars, German and British veterans. They were able to weigh a lot more heavily on that. You've let us down again, or how can this happen again? And it would have had to have been a different strategy, of course, because there was a far larger opposition to war in 1939 than there was in 1914, partly given the experiences of what had happened first time round. Whereas you'd say morally, you'd think that it would be a straight win because National Socialism isn't acceptable. So, yeah, I think it was a slightly different strategy. And like most wars, we probably had to start again from scratch because we tend to forget what we did in the last war and then panic and try and recreate that again second time round. But a really, really good question.
Okay, super. Thanks for the question, Becca. Sorry you couldn't join us for the to ask your question in person. Michael Plumley. Michael.
I've got Michael's question actually on the screen. I can see, David.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's read out Michael's question then.
Yeah. So, is there a lot of material for Imperial German propaganda, and are there any leads or sources that you know? What I would say is that I think I have got a list of a few of those. So, if Michael wanted to email me at at the Battle Honours email address or via
David. The best thing, rather
on.
than giving out an email address, if you just fire in the question, the point over to the link that you've got on Zoom, that's just probably a bit more secure.
Yeah, and then just but if you can get in touch, and then I'll send him what I've got.
Okay,
and I'll be able to do that offline. It's my pleasure. My pleasure.
Right, super. Thanks for that. I don't know if Joe Hayes' question has actually been answered by the one just previous. Joe, Joe, are you there at all?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hi, Joe. Right, just ask your question, Joe. I got a funny feeling it might have been touched on by Clive in a previous answer, but go ahead.
Yes, so I can ask Clive, but I can change it up a little bit. So I was going to ask about what's the main difference between propaganda posters in the First World War and the Second World War, what you thought was the biggest difference. But as that's kind of already been answered, what about First World War, maybe like a post and a different conflict post 1945? Would you say was the big differences in modern warfare?
I think we're a lot more questioning today, Joe, aren't we, of why we're going to war and stuff in the first place. So any military intervention is going to be a lot harder sell to us. And of course, the main thing would be the way we would produce it now. We're unlikely to see posters on the walls, are we, and stuff, declaring them. So a lot less reliant on the quality of the artist. And mind you, that'd be quite interesting to see, if anyone would be able to come up with sort of memes or GIFs in the modern day that would strike a chord as much as some of the famous posters of the Great War. I think that would be absolutely fascinating. What I know is someone like you will be giving this presentation in 10 years' time, because I know you're a star of the future in the history world, and you're probably not letting on that you're writing an essay on this very subject as we
Well,
speak. So I look forward to reading your
yeah.
paper, Joe. You're a good.
So yeah.
But you know, I'm really appreciate you coming on as well tonight. It's fantastic.
That's great.
I found it was rewarded. But I know that we can go into this in greater detail down the pub next time we're watching our beloved Charlton. Here you are, David. There's more than one of us.
No doubt, no doubt.
Okay, there we go. let's not do football. Mike Phipps, Mike, unmute yourself.
Thanks, David. Clive, cracking presentation as usual. Well done. Thanks for that. Just wondered how you assess Ian Hamilton's dealings with the press, Bartlett and Murdoch, particularly in the Gallipoli campaign.
Yeah, you know, Ian Hamilton, what a complex character. You know, I mean, I think I've got 3 or 4 biographies on him that have been written all from different angles that shows how diverse he was. I know that he wasn't overly keen on people like Ellis, Ashmead, Bartlett in particular, and would only give them bits and bobs that he felt that were particularly relevant, and probably in doing so, the way he treats them, it reflects on how he's regarded during the Gallipoli campaign. I think if he'd have had nowadays, going back to Joe's question to a degree, nowadays you will have press officers alongside you because it's such a minefield to deal with that he should have had someone advising him what to say and when to say it. Because if you look at the nature of those reportings, people like Murdoch especially, it changes, doesn't it? Swings so quickly in Gallipoli. From the initial few days to within a few weeks, it's very, very different. And it doesn't appear that Ian Hamilton has it in his armory to try and get them back on message or to get them to change their views. Isn't there a wonderful story when doesn't Bartlett at one stage get involved, shipwrecked off of Gallipoli, and everyone in the headquarters cheers or something when they hear he's gone down on a ship? I mean, he survives it, but so yeah, not very popular at all. Not very popular at all. Great question.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for that. Dan Harris, Dan, I can see you there. Do you want to find out the question?
Hello there.
Hi, Dan. And we're certainly not going to be talking about football now because this fella's a Millwall fan, and I thought it was in my contract not to allow him on screen.
You've given my secret away. No, Clive, nice to see you. Just a technicality. What actual power did Haig have to abolish censorship? Did he have some sort of full power?
Wow, that's a cracking question, Dan. God, this is where I hope Stephen Badsley's actually still involved and can come up with the answer. What power did he have? Well, he'd have the power to lift. I mean, when you think censorship was pretty much army regulated, in that you would, I think you had this deal where you handed your letters into your platoon commander, who would and censor through them and tell you what to take out and what to put in. So I guess the best power he could do is to actually via an army order say you're no longer to censor men's mail. They had this system where, because of there were quite a few sensitive things with relationships back home, if you didn't want your officer reading it, you could send in what we effectively now know as a bluey. It was like a different coloured letter that would bypass censorship, but that was done on the trust point of view, that you wouldn't put anything controversial in that letter and then your officers wouldn't read it. So, you know, if you responded to Dear Johns or what have you, and I mean, that censorship of mail, not only did it stop state secrets being sent back home or stop stories of how the war was being conducted in a negative way from going back home, but it also allowed perhaps the officers, the men's officers, to get an insight into their state of mind, which is quite important when you've got guys running around with, you know, cocked weapons and live ammunition in a sort of a tight place like a trench. So you know, it was important to probably your best insight into what was happening in their home lives is by reading their mail, as distasteful as that sounds 100 years on. Yeah, but I think that's it. I think I've convinced myself that's the answer. He would need to look for it now, but he would have issued an order to say stop censoring the mail.
Okay, that's good. Right. Thank you.
No worries. I'll see you down the virtual pub tomorrow night.
Cheers.
Thanks. Cheers. Christopher Reid. Christopher, do you want to unmute yourself there?
Yeah. In her book, Art at the Service of War, Canada's Art and the Great War, Maria Tebbit talks about Derwent Woods, Canada's Golgotha, and it being withdrawn from the war art exhibition by German diplomatic pressure. How far did that pressure go on after the 11th of November?
Oh no, it does continue, David, Christopher. Sorry, and I think the one that that stands out for me, of course, is the Machine Gun Corps Memorial, which was certainly no, it's the artist of the Machine Gun Corps Memorial. Is it a guy called Derwent, I think? But Derwent Wood, same guy, Derwent Wood. You're right, yeah. So when that was exhibited at the Royal Academy, there was one of the pieces that he did, which is obviously this one that we're talking about. I'll go for now, isn't it? I'm coming from memory. And again, this is that's absolutely right. And this is something I remember discussing with David Cohen at quite length, because I think he had the catalogue from that exhibition. They demanded that it was taken out because they felt it wasn't a true depiction of what occurred, despite now we've seen so many accounts of a crucifixion that took place on the battlefield. I think the story's got as far now as being able to identify the Canadian sergeant. Is a guy called Harry Band that was found crucified against a barn door somewhere during the Second Battle of Ypres. But the political pressure remained certainly right through to the 1920s, and it followed Derwent Wood round quite a lot, because remember when that Machine Gun Corps Memorial was unveiled, it was initially not that popular with people from the UK and from overseas. The imagery of using religion to depict the fact that is it David slays his hundreds, or Goliath slays hundreds while David is hundreds of thousands, or something, with a slingshot. I mean, do you have a view yourself on it? It's fascinating.
Well, it's as far as I heard a talk at London University, and I believe this was a few years ago, and at that stage the maquette was still in the reserve Canadian collection,
right,
and be exhibited. I just wonder how far general German influence on trying to keep things suppressed went on.
Well, I think that would probably be ground that we would be prepared to give in the post-war period if it was to keep people engaged on the diplomatic process, isn't it? I mean, it'd be one of the things that I was thinking, as a diplomat, if I was, going to give any ground, it would be allowing them to influence on some of the cultural exhibits or something to show willing.
Yeah.
Has it ever been shown publicly since, or?
Not that I'm aware. But you mentioning the body factory. I just wondered how far that went.
Well, that has been, and I know Stephen would know a lot better than me in that, because he's certainly written a book on the body factory. But my understanding is that long after the war, the Germans were still protesting at what went about there, and the sort of the problems that it had caused by us publishing those things in the first place. So I think the influence certainly goes through the 1920s.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just on the body factory question, if anybody who hasn't picked it up, we did have Stephen Badsey talking a few months ago about that particular subject, and the webinar is available on the WFA's YouTube channel. So just go and have a look for that if you want to find out a bit more about the body factory question. Andrew Boyd, just want to unmute yourself, and we'll get your question in there.
I think I can see Andrew's question.
Okay.
So it's further to trade unionists been shepherded on to trips to the Western Front. Would ILP members have been invited? Do you know what? That's fascinating. I have got, I think, a list somewhere, Andrew, of everyone that was on that tour. So I think I'm pretty certain. So if you wanted to, again, get in touch and email. Let me see what it is, and I can certainly. What I'll do is I'll scan in the whole of the program for you, so you can see it page on page. Gives the itinerary, the timings, and I think it's a list of people there, and you might be able to pick up some ILP names off of that list.
Super, thanks for that. Sorry we can't.
It's okay.
Got that.
No
Thanks,
problem.
Andrew. Cheers. No problem. Arthur, do you want to just unmute yourself there?
Thank you, Clive. Excellent talk, and thank you for your virtual tours as well. They've been good.
Oh, thank you.
You've talked a lot about the propaganda going out, but my question, as you see, is about the effect of it at home. How did the press continue to have a positive effect on the population when the casualty lists grew, soldiers came home with the stories of what had happened?
No, absolutely. It's a very good one. I'd say that they managed to maintain a very tentative hold on that public opinion, and they would do that by weighting the potential for positives in the war against the reality of what was occurring, if that makes sense. So it would almost be influencing the people at home that, the words, you only have to walk across the headstones when you go into any cemetery in France today, and you're struck by the dominant use of the words duty and sacrifice. And yet, I'm sure if the Commonwealth War Graves now, erased all those messages and contacted surviving relatives today and said, right, want you to put something on the headstone, how rarely that would occur. And that's not a good thing. I'm saying that, our views today are very different, aren't they, to the people that fought the generation that fought the war themselves. So I think by maintaining that idea that, yes, these losses are great, but they are for a just cause and they are a necessity of modern war, they just about managed to keep a sort of a lid on it. And we've all seen exceptions of it. I'm always mindful to a story, a series of letters I've got to a young lad who was Irish lad in the Munster Fusiliers who was killed at Suvla Bay in the August of 1914. And I've got a series of letters from his father writing directly to the War Office, saying, my lad was 17. Why was he out there when there are so many men at home of older age that should have been in his place? He's my only son. My life has ended because of your negligence. And it's a really hard hitting, cutting letter. So there's no doubt that a lot of families felt that way. But overall, our propaganda unit and the way the press worked meant that was almost, I can imagine almost like putting saucepan lids on all of the little arguments. And then so March 18, where we really are, March to April 18, backs to the wall. By all accounts, when you read things like Alexander's Enduring the Great War and things like that, British morale was pretty high at that time. And that was because a lot of British morale was put in the faith, this is on the soldier's perspective, put in the faith of your mates, as opposed to the faith in your religion, which was a lot stronger on the German side. So they began to question that a lot earlier. But given the backdrop of what occurs in March and April 1918, then to switch the attention away from the retreats and onto Zeebrugge, which is a boys' own raid, also does a lot, doesn't it? If they'd have studied the casualties at Zeebrugge compared to what we achieved, they would have been horrified reading in itself. And I'm not sure that those casualty figures were ever actually promoted in the press.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Arthur. Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur. Derek, fire away.
Hello.
Hi there.
Hi, Clive.
Hi, Derek.
The question is that you said about the tentative grip the propaganda had and how it was such a successful operation through the war and after. But has that legacy hindered the real recording of actual war crimes and the atrocities that did happen? And even today, is that still a stumbling block for researchers looking into events when they're kind of all grouped together and brushed under the carpet as just fake news?
Yeah, that's a really good point, that. So if we're talking about the I guess in the main we're talking about the sort of atrocities that occurred in the first few months of the war, right? In the Battle of the Frontiers and what have you.
And early 1915, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think the evidence is there, isn't it? From a researcher, it's hard to find the the archival documented evidence of things like this, largely because the areas where it occurred, of course, were under German occupation for large parts of the war. You know, I'm thinking of Ypres and certainly the just prior to Ypres, you know, the 9 Men of Iron, that sort of thing. But I had a little point there. Now let me think about it, because my mind's gone, as it always does, but it was quite relevant. Oh no, the evidence is there for you, because if you go into we tend to go into cemeteries that have Commonwealth War Graves Commission pointed at them, but actually any of the civilian cemeteries in these towns, you don't have to go too far before you come across graves of mayors where it says, you know, Fusillade de l'Allemands. And so I don't think, I mean, it's a lot of effort to go and find these things, but you know, the evidence is there in stone, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so they're well recorded by the local community generally, so it didn't really matter if the Germans destroyed things.
And a lot of it post-war, when the Germans left, you know, they made a bigger thing about saying right now is the time to record, you know, the shoemaker that was pulled out and shot in the middle of the night by the Germans. And I mean, I don't have any sort of sympathy, empathy with that sort of atrocities that went on. I just know from soldiering that if I'd have been a young German soldier crossing the frontier with the stories that I'd have been told by my sergeant majors about the 1870 war or whatever, I'd have probably been a lot more trigger sort of nervous. And so that's, I mean, you could put that all into the fog of war, can't you? But there would have been a lot of quite scared Germans, I think, edging their way forward, waiting for civilians to shoot at them, as they were sort of told that was about to happen. But of course, that in no way justifies any of the atrocities that went on. But it's a good point. There's a lot of that has been suppressed. Whether that's been suppressed as a result of the propaganda or not, I'm not sure. But
my feeling was that it was just kind of all got stuck into one big group, you know.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it is. Yeah, and but I think there are books on this now, aren't there, that started to come out. There was a very there's a very important book actually that for the Second World War lists all of those sort of atrocities in 1940. Now, to have an equivalent one of 1914, I think would be quite a fascinating resource to have. So that's your job, to go away. You can start on that tomorrow.
Thanks, Clive.
No problem.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks for that. Okay, last question last pair of questions for the evening. Stephen, you've got 2 questions there.
Hi, Stephen.
Right. Good evening. Thanks, Clive. I've still got my notes from Professor Badsley's lectures as well from the same MA course.
Fascinating, isn't it?
2 questions. Did the French army have an equivalent secret war propaganda agency?
Yeah. Okay. I'm not so sure, and I don't think it was as well established. So I hope I'm not doing them an injustice in that. I don't think there was a lot of the reason we had one was through necessity, because the size of our ground forces, whereas France probably didn't see it as a primary function they required to do, because they had an army that was large enough to sustain the war through the first years. So that's my gut feeling.
Okay. Yeah. And then the second one then, on the home front and propaganda posters that we use on the home front.
Yeah.
Do you know at all if Vera Brittain would have been involved in having an input in those sort of posters to encourage support at home? Because I know that I'm aware, again, coming back to Professor Badsley's lectures, that there was a lot of strong support for from Lloyd George and also Douglas Haig in recognising the prominence of the role of the home front, and particularly the role of women. And I immediately thought that of Vera Brittain and the prominence that she did, in particular her contribution to the VADs. I wonder if there was a role that she had in promoting or a connection with propaganda and the contribution that women should make.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating, because of course Vera, I mean, she's definitely affected personally, isn't she, by the way the war outcomes, and obviously the loss of her brother and her fiance probably impacts a lot on the way she views the war. But even I mean, even in 1918, she's writing all this stuff about, you know, and here they come, the Americans war abreast, and how fantastic specimens they look and what have you. So she's still pouring in that sort of positive messagery of the war. I've not come across her in any way involved in developing posters at all. What I can add is the significant importance of the women's role on the home front. Is in part, and no doubt, because it's partly my own theory, this is that, you know, in Britain in 1914, a lot of our industry was driven by that explosion of the arts and crafts culture about quality over quantity. So, you know, if you were going to simplify that, we're able to provide you with a one-of-a-kind bespoke handmade 18-pounder shell carved by the artisan worker, and actually what we need is someone who's going to make 1 million of them in a day. And so we have to de-arts and crafts ourselves and turn ourselves into an industrial manufacturer pretty much overnight, which is what I think is actually one of our most significant contributions to the Great War, is that we turn ourselves into that engineering powerhouse again and are able to gear up for that war effort. And locally, to me, that's important because of the role of women in the Woolwich Arsenal and getting them in. So I've no doubt that people like Haig at a very early stage would have understood the importance of this, because he needs the men, but he also needs the shells. And my own nan, actually, great-grandmother, worked at Wargill's tent manufacturers who had, I think, were in Camberwell and Acton making tents. So I always thought she was making bullets. Turns out it was tents after all these years, but there we are.
And then one very, very nuanced question.
Good.
Alfred Leet, the artist who drew or painted that famous Kitchener poster.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Do you know if there's a has someone written a biography on Leet?
I'm not aware of one at all. I know that we're still debating exactly, you know, how much influence that poster had, aren't we, 100 years on, and you know, whether it was seen by a handful of Boy Scouts that got one copy of the London Illustrated News, or whether it was indeed on every railway station up and down the country, which I'm led to believe isn't the case, is it? No, I don't. I don't know if that's been written, but
all right.
I wish I had the answer.
Once again, most enjoyable.
No, that's all right. No, thanks for hanging on so long to ask.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Right.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for that. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's that's it as far as Q&As are concerned. We'll call that a day now at 9:30. I've just got an email in from Stephen Babsey. Clive, just thanking you for mentioning his book for the start off. He's had to bail out before the Q&A is finished, but he's also thanking you for drawing attention to Haig's media war skills, or what they called at the time front propaganda. So I'll certainly pass the email from Stephen on to you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll just leave it to everybody who's watching to do
one quick point, David, quickly, because it's come in very quickly. In case Stephen Rees hasn't seen it, I think he has. Kate Wills has said that there is a biography of Lees that's been published by Taylor. So I think they're taking that offline. So that question was answered at the end.
Okay.
What a great audience we have. Yeah. Sorry, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Cheers. Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, once again, a virtual round of applause, please, for Clive's superb presentation about that interesting subject of propaganda, and casting a light into that particular dark corner. And I can confirm there's stacks of hands going up there now, Clive, as a virtual round of applause. So that it leaves me just to say, please do continue registering nice and early for these webinars that are going to continue. We'll reduce the output of them to about one a week going forward into April and May. It's just probably sensible to reduce that. If you do enjoy these, and I know I'm asked for this quite frequently, if people are enjoying these and they wish to make a donation, there is absolutely no need to, but we do actually have a donation button on the WFA website now. if you feel so inclined. But these will remain free to members to watch, so there's absolutely no need for any payment to be made. Clive, thanks very much from me for once again a superb presentation.
Thank you.
I thoroughly enjoyed this evening's talk. I feel thoroughly educated in the dark arts of propaganda now. And ladies and gentlemen, let's just leave it at that and say please do come along to the future webinars which will be taking place in coming weeks. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for watching. Good night.
Cheerio.
Mademoiselle.